The rain was relentless that night, hammering against the cobblestone streets of New York like the steady pulse of an unseen force. Barron Trump walked briskly down Fifth Avenue, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his tailored coat, shielding himself from the icy wind that howled to the towering steel giants of the city. It had been one of those long nights, one filled with obligations, handshakes, and the weight of a last name that carried history on its back. As he turned a corner, near a dimly lit bookstore, a shadow stirred in the alleyway beside him. A boy, no older than 12, sat hunched against a pile of discarded newspapers, his face hidden beneath the hood of a tattered sweatshirt. His arms were wrapped around his knees, attempting to find warmth in a city that had long since stopped caring for the forgotten. Barron hesitated. He had been raised with privilege, taught to navigate the worlds of diplomacy, business, and media scrutiny. But something about this boy, this fragile figure in the cold, made him stop in his tracks. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across the pavement. "Hey!" Barron called out, his voice hesitant but kind. "You okay?" The boy didn't respond at first. He merely lifted his head slightly, revealing striking blue eyes that were too bright, too knowing for someone so young. His lips were cracked, his hands trembling from the cold. Barron took a step closer. "You got a name." The boy smirked, a sad, knowing smirk that spoke volumes. Names don't mean much when you're invisible. Barron felt a strange pang in his chest. He had never known true struggle, not like this. But he had always been fascinated by stories, by the human experience, by the different lives that unfolded beyond the golden gates of his world. "Everyone has a name," Barron said, "even if it's just one they give themselves." The boy shrugged. "Then call me, I don't know, Storyteller." Barron crouched down, ignoring the cold seeping through his expensive shoes. "Storyteller, huh? That's a pretty cool name. You like stories." The boy's eyes lit up, just for a moment. "Used to. Back when I had books. Back when I had a home." The words hit Barron harder than he expected. "You write?" Barron asked. The boy hesitated before nodding. "In my head. No paper. No pen." Barron reached into his pocket, pulled out a sleek, leather-bound notebook, the kind he used for jotting down ideas, thoughts, or sketches. He extended it toward the boy. "Then write one now," Barron said. "With me." The boy stared at the notebook, as if it were something rare and sacred. His fingers twitched before slowly reaching out to take it. "What kind of story?" the boy whispered. Barron smiled. "Ours." And so, on a cold night in New York, under the flickering glow of streetlights and the symphony of raindrops, a homeless boy and the son of a billionaire sat together, writing a story that would change both of their lives forever. The notebook felt heavy in the boy's hands, not in weight, but in meaning. He hadn't held something like this in so long, clean, unblemished pages, waiting to be filled with words. His fingers traced the leather cover, as if trying to convince himself that this was real, that this was his. Barron watched him, waiting. He could tell that the boy wanted to speak, but wasn't sure how. The rain had lessened, leaving the alley in an eerie, damp silence, interrupted only by the occasional honk of a distant taxi or the hum of the city that never truly slept. "You really want me to write something?" the boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Barron nodded. "Yeah, but not just anything. I want to hear your story." The boy scoffed, pulling the hood tighter around his face. "Why, my story's not worth telling." Barron frowned. "Says who?" The boy hesitated. He had heard that phrase before. From teachers, from passing strangers, from people who thought they were being kind but never actually stopped to listen. But there was something different in Barron's voice. A sincerity, a patience. With a deep breath, the boy finally flipped open the notebook to the first page. The paper was smooth beneath his fingers, so foreign compared to the rough scraps of cardboard he sometimes used to scribble thoughts with half-broken pencils. "What if I mess up?" the boy asked, not meeting Barron's eyes. "Then you turn the page," Barron said simply. That's the thing about stories. You can always start a new chapter. The boy let out a small, almost bitter laugh. Not everyone gets new chapters. Barron didn't respond right away. He knew the world wasn't fair. He knew that his life and the boy's life were different in ways that couldn't be ignored. But right here, right now, in this moment, they were just two kids in the same city, trying to understand each other. "You do," Barron said finally. "You have this one. Right now." The boy exhaled slowly, then pressed a pen to paper. At first, his hand trembled. The words didn't come easily. His thoughts were jumbled, tangled in memories he didn't want to revisit. Then, finally, he wrote, "Once, there was a boy with no name." Barron leaned in slightly, reading over his shoulder. "That's a good start." The boy nodded but didn't stop. The pen moved again, the letters forming faster, more confidently. He was a ghost in his own world, drifting through streets that never saw him. Some nights, he would tell himself stories to feel like he was real. Stories about what his life could have been, what it still might be. Barron remained silent, watching. The boy's face had changed, his eyes locked onto the page with an intensity that hadn't been there before. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't invisible. He was being heard. One night, under the glow of the city lights, someone finally saw him. Someone who wasn't supposed to. And in that moment, the ghost became something else. The boy stopped writing. His hand hovered over the page, his breath unsteady. Barron finally spoke. "Became what?" The boy swallowed hard, blinking as if waking from a trance. "I don't know yet." Barron smiled. "Then we keep going." For the first time that night, the boy smiled back. It was small, hesitant, but real. He turned the page, pen ready. And so, under the hum of a city that never stopped moving, the boy with no name and the billionaire's son continued their story, one word at a time. The boy kept writing. For the first time in a long time, the world around him faded. The cold of the night, the ache in his stomach, the weight of exhaustion, all of it melted into the background as the ink bled onto the page. He had no idea how long he had been writing, but when he finally looked up, Barron was still there, waiting, watching, not judging. The boy let out a breath and closed the notebook. "That's all I got for now," he muttered. Barron nodded. "It's good." The boy scoffed. "You don't have to say that." "I'm not just saying it," Barron insisted. "It really is." He tapped the notebook lightly. "The way you write. It's like you're letting people into your world, and it makes them want to stay." The boy blinked. No one had ever said something like that to him before. He had always been told he was a burden, a mistake, a kid who slipped through the cracks. But never a storyteller, never someone worth listening to. Barron shifted, glancing down at the closed notebook. "You said you didn't have a name," he said. "But that's not true." The boy frowned. "What do you mean?" Barron met his gaze. "You just wrote one." He tapped the cover of the notebook. "You called yourself Storyteller." The boy hesitated. The name had started as a joke, something he threw out without thinking. But hearing Barron say it, hearing it spoken like it meant something, felt different, like it belonged to him, like he belonged to it. "Storyteller," he whispered, testing the word in his mouth. Barron smiled. "It fits." The boy, Storyteller, didn't know what to say. For so long, he had been nobody, a face in the crowd, a shadow on the sidewalk. But tonight, in the flickering glow of the streetlights, he was something more. Barron stretched his legs, standing up and brushing off his coat. "You know, I think you've got a real gift," he said. "You ever thought about doing this for real?" Storyteller laughed dryly. "Doing what for real?" "Sitting in the street and scribbling in a notebook." "I mean writing," Barron clarified. "Actually telling stories. Sharing them with people." Storyteller shrugged. "Not exactly easy when you don't even have a place to sleep." Barron hesitated. He had spent his life in mansions, surrounded by security, comfort, and privilege. He had never known what it was like to go without, to wake up in the same clothes he fell asleep in, to wonder where his next meal would come from. But right now, that didn't matter. Right now, all that mattered was the boy in front of him and the story he had to tell. Barron pulled out his phone and tapped the screen a few times. "There's a diner a couple blocks away," he said. "They're open late. If you come with me, I'll get you something to eat, and we can keep writing." Storyteller stiffened. His instinct screamed at him to say no. People who offered kindness usually wanted something in return. That was a lesson he had learned early. But Barron didn't look like he wanted anything. He just looked genuine. Storyteller's stomach growled loudly, betraying him. He sighed. "Fine, but I'm getting pancakes." Barron grinned. "Deal." And so, for the first time in a long time, Storyteller stood up, not as a nameless kid on the street, but as someone who had something to say, as someone whose words mattered. Together, he and Barron disappeared into the city, walking side by side. And as they walked, a new chapter began. The diner was nearly empty, except for an older couple in the back booth and a tired waitress refilling coffee cups. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, casting a warm, yellowish glow over the faded checkered floor. It wasn't the fanciest place, but to Storyteller, it might as well have been a palace. Barron slid into a booth by the window, and Storyteller hesitated before doing the same. The warmth of the diner hit him like a wave, seeping into his bones, chasing away the chill of the street. He hadn't been inside a place like this in months. The waitress, a woman with deep lines around her eyes and a name tag that read Lisa, approached with a pen tucked behind her ear. "What can I get you boys?" she asked, eyeing Storyteller's ragged hoodie, but saying nothing. "Pancakes," Storyteller said immediately. "Big stack." Lisa smirked. "You got it, Han." She glanced at Barron. "And for you?" Barron barely looked at the menu. "Same." Lisa scribbled the order down and walked away. Storyteller leaned back, crossing his arms. "So, what's the deal with you?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. "Why are you out here at midnight, feeding stray kids?" Barron raised an eyebrow. "You're not a stray." Storyteller snorted. "Close enough." Barron considered his words carefully. He hesitated. "I just wanted to know your story. That's all." Storyteller studied him. "People don't just do things for no reason." Barron sighed. "Maybe not. But that doesn't mean I want something from you." For a long moment neither spoke. Then Storyteller exhaled. "Fine. You want my story? Here's the short version. I don't have a home. Haven't for a while. My mom, she wasn't great at the whole being a mom thing. And my dad, he wasn't there. So I figured I was better off on my own." Barron didn't flinch. He just listened. Storyteller picked at the peeling edge of the table. "At first, I thought it'd be like one of those adventure movies. You know, kid survives on the streets, learns to hustle, finds a way out." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Turns out, real life isn't a movie." Barron nodded. "Yeah, real life's messy." Storyteller looked up, surprised. He had expected pity, maybe even disbelief. But Barron just understood. Lisa returned with their pancakes, setting down 2 towering stacks of golden, buttery perfection. "Extra syrup, just how I like it," Storyteller muttered. "You read my mind, Lisa." She chuckled. "Enjoy, kid." As soon as she walked away, Storyteller dug in. He ate fast, like someone who wasn't sure when their next meal would be. Barron didn't say anything. He just let him eat. After a few minutes, Storyteller finally slowed down, exhaling. "Okay, now your turn." Barron blinked. "My turn for what?" "You said you wanted my story," Storyteller said, pointing his fork at him. "So what's your story?" Barron hesitated. "I mean, it's not really that interesting." Storyteller raised an eyebrow. "Dude, you're a trump. You don't get to say your life isn't interesting." Barron smirked. Fair point. He took a bite of his pancakes, thinking, I guess my life's always been kind of planned out. Schools, expectations, public appearances. Everyone knows my name before I even get to introduce myself. Storyteller tilted his head. That sounds exhausting. Barron shrugged. It can be. He poked at his pancakes. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to just disappear. To be someone else. Even for a little while. Storyteller snorted. You want to switch? I'll take your penthouse. You take my street corner. Barron chuckled. Maybe not exactly like that. He leaned forward. But I think that's why I like writing. It's the one place where I get to choose who I am. Who anybody is. Storyteller stared at him for a second, then nodded. Yeah, I get that. Barron gestured toward the notebook. So, what happens next? Storyteller frowned. What do you mean? In your story, Barron said, the boy with no name. What happens after someone finally sees him? Storyteller hesitated. I don't know. I always figured he'd just keep going. Alone? Yeah. Barron shook his head. Not anymore. Storyteller narrowed his eyes. And what's that supposed to mean? Barron met his gaze. Serious now. It means you're not invisible anymore. Not to me. The words hit harder than Storyteller expected. For the longest time, he had convinced himself that he didn't need anyone, that he was fine being alone, that asking for help was a weakness. But sitting here, across from someone who saw him, really saw him, he wasn't so sure anymore. He glanced at the notebook, then back at Barron. I guess we'll have to figure out the ending together. Barron smiled. Yeah, I guess we will. And for the first time in a long time, Storyteller didn't feel so lost. Because maybe, just maybe, this was the start of a new chapter. The pancakes were gone. Only a sticky mess of syrup and crumbs remained on the plates, along with 2 half-empty glasses of water. The warmth of the diner still wrapped around them like a protective cocoon, shielding them from the cold, unforgiving city waiting outside. Storyteller leaned back against the booth, arms crossed, his stomach full for the first time in days. He didn't want to admit it, not to Barron, not even to himself, but it felt good to sit here, to talk, to be seen. But the night had a way of creeping back in. So, Storyteller said, drumming his fingers against the table. What now? Barron tilted his head. What do you mean? Storyteller gestured around them. This. He narrowed his eyes. You brought me here, bought me food, listened to my story. But people don't just do that. At least, not for me. Barron sighed. You really think I have some secret agenda? Storyteller shrugged. I think people don't give without expecting something back. Barron met his gaze. Then maybe you've never met the right people. Storyteller frowned. He wanted to argue, to tell Barron that life wasn't that simple. But deep down, some small part of him wanted to believe him. Still, he wasn't about to let his guard down completely. I don't do charity, Storyteller muttered. Barron smirked. Good. Because this isn't charity. He tapped the notebook. This is a deal. Storyteller raised an eyebrow. A deal? Barron nodded. You want to write, right? I mean, yeah. Then let's do it, Barron said. Together, Storyteller stared at him, skeptical. Do what, exactly? Barron sat up straighter. We write your story. The real one. We tell it. And we finish it. With an ending that you choose. Storyteller blinked. You're serious. Completely. A long silence stretched between them. Storyteller didn't know what to say. No one had ever believed in him like this. No one had ever asked him to finish his own story, as if it was something that mattered. But at the same time, the idea terrified him. I don't know how to do that, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Barron smiled. Good thing I do. Storyteller's lips parted, but no words came out. For so long, he had thought of himself as a kid who had been left behind, a ghost wandering through the city, a character without a real ending. But here was someone telling him he could have one, that he deserved one, that maybe he wasn't lost at all. Finally, he exhaled and reached for the notebook. "All right," he said. "Let's make a deal." Barron grinned. "Deal." And just like that, the story continued. But this time, Storyteller wasn't writing it alone. The deal was made. Storyteller didn't know what it meant yet, what Barron expected from him, or where this strange night would lead. But something in his gut told him to trust it. For the first time in a long time, he wanted to believe that something good could come from this. Barron tapped the notebook with his fingers. "All right, let's figure this out." Storyteller smirked. "You sound like a businessman." Barron shrugged. "Guess that's in my blood." He leaned forward. "So, tell me, what's the first real memory you want to put in this story?" Storyteller hesitated. His fingers hovered over the notebook's cover, feeling the smooth leather. The first real memory? There were so many. The hunger, the cold, the nights he spent curled up in subway stations, pretending he was somewhere else. But those weren't the memories he wanted to define him. He closed his eyes. Think. And then, like a crack of thunder, it hit him. "The first time I ran away," he said. Barron nodded. "Okay, what happened?" Storyteller took a deep breath and opened the notebook. The pen felt familiar now, like an extension of himself. Slowly, carefully, he started to write. The boy with no name didn't wake up one morning and decide to disappear. It wasn't some grand act of rebellion, like in the movies. No, it happened the way most things in life do, slowly, then all at once. He was 12 the first time he left. Not because he wanted to, but because he had to. His mother was passed out on the couch, the stench of something bitter in the air. The rent hadn't been paid in months. The fridge was empty. He had waited. He had hoped things would change, that she would change. But when the landlord pounded on the door, yelling about eviction, he knew there was nothing left to wait for. So he left. Storyteller stopped, staring at the words. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. He had never told this to anyone before. Not like this. Barron didn't say anything right away. He just read the words, his expression unreadable. Finally, he exhaled. "That's powerful." Storyteller shrugged. "It's just the truth." Barron met his gaze. "That's what makes it powerful." For the first time, Storyteller felt something strange in his chest. It wasn't just relief. It was something bigger. Like maybe, just maybe, telling his story was the first step to changing it. Barron leaned back. So what happened next? Storyteller took a deep breath, and then he kept writing. That night, in a quiet diner at the edge of a city that had forgotten him, Storyteller wrote the first real chapter of his life. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of how it would end. The words poured onto the page like rain hitting pavement. The more Storyteller wrote, the lighter he felt, as if every sentence peeled away a layer of the weight he had been carrying for so long. Barron sat across from him, quiet but attentive, watching as the story unfolded. He had seen a lot of things in his life. Power, privilege, expectations pressing down on his shoulders like invisible chains. But this was different. This was real. Storyteller paused, his hand cramping slightly from writing so much, so fast. He glanced up at Barron. "You sure you want to hear all this?" Barron smirked. "I think I made that pretty clear when I bought you pancakes." Storyteller chuckled, shaking his head. "Fair point." He tapped the pen against the notebook. "So, what now?" Barron thought for a moment. "Now, we figure out what comes next." Storyteller narrowed his eyes. "You keep saying that, but what does it mean?" Barron leaned forward. "It means we don't just write your story. We change it." Storyteller blinked. "What?" Barron tapped the notebook. "You said it yourself. Real life isn't like the movies. You don't always get a happy ending handed to you." He nodded toward the words on the page. "But this proves that you're more than just some kid the world forgot." Storyteller swallowed hard. And what if I am? Barron shook his head. You're not. The certainty in his voice made Storyteller's chest tighten. For so long, he had convinced himself that he didn't matter, that the world had already decided who he was: a nobody, a ghost, a kid who slipped through the cracks and never came back. But Barron wasn't letting him believe that. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to believe it either. Storyteller took a shaky breath. So what do we do? Barron grinned. We tell your story. And then we make sure people hear it. Storyteller frowned. How? Barron pulled out his phone and tapped the screen a few times before flipping it around. A blank document was open. Start writing, Barron said. Storyteller's eyes widened. Wait, you mean... Barron nodded. We put it out there. Maybe a blog. Maybe something bigger. His voice softened. You said no one ever listened before. Let's change that. Storyteller hesitated. The idea of people reading his words, knowing his past, knowing him, it was terrifying. But deep down, there was a spark. A part of him that wanted to believe. Slowly, he reached for the phone. The screen glowed beneath his fingertips. And then, for the first time, he started to write his story where the world could see it. That night, a homeless boy and a billionaire's son sat in a diner, building a bridge between their worlds, one word at a time. And neither of them knew it yet, but they were about to change everything. The night stretched on, but neither of them cared. Storyteller's fingers hovered over the glowing phone screen. He could feel his pulse in his fingertips, the weight of a moment he wasn't sure he was ready for. Barron watched him carefully. He wasn't pushing, wasn't demanding, just waiting, like he always did. You really think people will care? Storyteller asked, his voice quieter than before. Barron nodded. I do. Storyteller swallowed hard. His life had always been about survival, about slipping through cracks, staying unseen, moving before anyone could get close enough to ask questions. But now, someone was close. Someone who had seen him, really seen him. And the truth was, he didn't want to be invisible anymore. Taking a deep breath, he started typing. There once was a boy with no name. He was a ghost in his own city, a shadow no one saw, a kid who walked through the world unnoticed. He thought that was just how things were, how they would always be, until one night, someone saw him, not as a problem, not as a lost cause, not as another kid on the street, but as a storyteller. And for the first time, he wasn't just surviving. He was living. Asterisk. Barron leaned in, reading over his shoulder. He grinned. That's a hell of a start. Storyteller exhaled, staring at the words on the screen. It felt different. Final. Like the beginning of something new. He looked at Barron. So, what now? Barron smirked. Now we hit post. Storyteller hesitated, his thumb hovering over the button. Once he did this, there was no going back. His story, the one he had kept buried for so long, would be out there. But maybe that was the point. Maybe it was time for the world to see him. He pressed the button. The post went live. And just like that, the boy with no name became someone worth remembering. Epilogue. The next morning, Storyteller woke up in a hotel room. A real bed. A real roof over his head. Barron had insisted. And for once, Storyteller didn't fight him on it. His phone vibrated. He picked it up and nearly dropped it. The post had exploded. Thousands of people had read it overnight, shared it, commented. People asking how to help. People who had been in his shoes, telling him they understood. People who cared. Storyteller's heart pounded. He wasn't invisible anymore. Barron's name was trending, too. But for once, it wasn't about politics or power. It was about two kids from opposite worlds, meeting in the rain and writing something real. A knock came at the door. Storyteller opened it. Barron grinned, holding up 2 cups of coffee. Told you people would listen. Storyteller smirked, taking the cup. Guess we got a lot more to write. Barron nodded. Yeah, and this time, You get to choose how the story ends. And for the first time in his life, Storyteller believed it.